Guys, welcome back to the channel. As you can see on this format, we're going to be doing another podcast type of video, and this time I want to talk to you guys about the different types of drift car that you could use or build and how I feel about them. It would be a standard type car with bolt-ons, of which a very good example would be the M3 for Drift Week, which basically had a bolted-on lock kit, coilovers, handbrake, and some other supporting modifications. But it's not a completely built car. It still has the original engine, original gearbox, differential. The second category would be a car that's had more extensive modification than just bolt-ons. So an engine swap, but still a car that would remain road legal. There's a lot of those cars around. I think the majority of drift cars would fall in that category. So you should think about an S chassis with an LS swap, but people still drive it on the roads. And the third category, obviously, you can already guess that, would be a completely built pro car, like a Formula Drift car, or maybe a Pro-Am car or something like that. So a car that you would typically not want to drive on the road anymore. My opinion on this matter is that you'll get the most seat time from category 1 and category 3. Obviously everybody always talks about seat time, so I think we can all agree that seat time is very important. Of course, there's also other requirements. There's guys that say like, hey, for me it's more important that the car looks good, has a certain stance, and I choose that over economy, or I choose that over seat time, which is totally fine. I love that too. I love those type of cars, and I love how those guys accept that stuff can fail at an alarming rate, and that's the price that they're willing to pay to have the best looking, cool looking car out there. So in this video we will be focusing a little bit on the seat time goal, and obviously also the goal of economics, so trying to do things as financially wise as possible. So the bolt-on car, obviously, that has the advantage that it's very simple. You just buy a car, so you buy a 350Z or you buy an M3 and you modify that until you can drift it. The great thing about that is that you're relying on all the original equipment that's in the car, that's meant to be in the car. So it will usually have a differential, a gearbox that can take the power of the engine, and you don't have to fabricate all kinds of things. Obviously it's it's very clear that there are various degrees of fabrication, and that most stuff that people make is not as good as original stuff from the factory. So that's a very, very big pro for those cars. So you'll generally get a lot of seat time out of them. The M3 did very, very well at Drift Week. Big part of that, of course, was that they are already pretty good cars to start from the factory. Obviously there's also downsides. One of them would be cost, because a car that has reasonable power, like a Corvette or an M3 or maybe a Skyline, is already a little bit more expensive than just getting a rolling S chassis. Another disadvantage would be the wow factor. Obviously if people see a standard M3 or a Corvette with bolt-ons, it's not like as mind-blowing as a completely built car, or a car that's got a huge body kit on it and a completely different engine in it. So there's a downside, so it has less wow factor. If we move to the second category of these cars, which is difficult for me to find a name for it, so maybe call them in-between. So an in-between car, it may not sound very respectful, but in this case I think that's the best designation for it. An in-between car would typically be, let's say that you take a BMW E36, like a rolling chassis that you get somewhere with, maybe with a blown engine or something, although that's not very likely in an E36, but let's just assume. And you want to swap something in that, maybe an LS, maybe an RB or a JZ or an SR or something cool. And you're going to be doing that step by step. So obviously you buy the car first, which is very cheap, and then you buy an engine. Obviously the type of people that build these cars are not made of money, so they get some junkyard engine or something like that, the second-hand stuff. And then obviously you can have a very cheap car which makes 400 or 500 horsepower. So that's very cool. Obviously it's also cool to build stuff. The experience is nice, you learn a lot from it, so that's not a pro. But sadly there's also some disadvantages from that. It's actually the most difficult car to build, if you ask me, because it's basically choosing a pair of shoes that you're going to wear to the club, but you're also going to play football with. And that's obviously very, very difficult. So we've got clients that come to me that say like, hey Wout, can you build me a car? But it doesn't have to be full pro. I also want it to be streetable, so it doesn't have to be all out. And then they expect that that's like cheaper than a full pro build. It's actually not, because that car needs to do two things at the same time. We need to take a look at all the road legal stuff. If you guys have a better suggestion of how I should call those cars, please let me know, because I feel bad saying it almost all the time. But I'm just going to continue doing it. So the in-between car would be very difficult for me to make, because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. And in my opinion, you need to accept a lot of flaws and a lot of compromises when you build one of these cars. Because what people typically do is they leave the original fuel tank in the car, they leave the original wiring loom in the car, and they somehow need to make all that communicate with that performance engine, which is not very easy. So what you see a lot is that guys want to run like an AN type of oil line or an AN type of fuel line on an engine, which totally doesn't work with the original hardware that's in the car. And it's the same with electrics and electronics. So that's two things that I touched upon, like the fuel and the electrics. I always like to call these types of cars like the drifter's graveyard, because there's a lot of guys that start drifting in a basically standard car and they're doing well and they're enjoying it and they can financially control it, and then they want to move up, but they want to do it in little steps. And that's why a lot of guys get frustrated with the problems that happen with the car, and they are losing control financially, and they quit drifting forever. So that's a very, very difficult subject. Everybody has gone through this phase, I think. Another thing is that if you choose a drifting engine, we're going to do a podcast on drifting engines separately, so I won't go into it too much, is that you also need a gearbox, and obviously is that it's very cheap to get an LS or a second-hand junkyard JZ or something like that, or maybe a Barra if you're in Australia. But the gearbox is always a different story, like a good performance gearbox for a road car like a T56 or V160 or whatever. They're expensive gearboxes, they're hard to get. So what happens is that people start matching some kind of other gearbox like a CD009 or a ZF gearbox with an adapter to fit that JZ or to fit that LS. I'm not a huge fan of that. I won't go too deep into that as much. I also don't want to knock the great people that make these adapter kits. Some of them are very much a work of art, but I just don't like the concept very much. It also requires you to run a certain flywheel, which is usually an offset, and I'm just not crazy about all these conversion kits. Another thing is that these gearboxes are also, like, as everybody knows, I also have a normal shop in BMW and Porsche, and we do some other performance cars, and we see failures of all these fabled diesel gearboxes and CD009 gearboxes. We see them fail on the street in road cars with low mileage that are maybe a couple years old. So they're not that fantastic as everybody always says, especially if you start running grip. Brings us to step 3, and that's a fully built car. Obviously that's my passion. I love to do a complete bare body, like completely strip the chassis, weld in a good cage, and yeah, just get a good performance engine, preferably a newly made engine, and get an aftermarket racing gearbox like G-force, quick change differentials, all that kinds of stuff. Obviously everybody is like jumping in their seat right now saying, no, Wout, you don't need that, you don't need that. Well, it's not my first rodeo, and I speak to a lot of people all over the world. I don't want to sound arrogant, but as soon as you move into that territory, it may cost a little bit more, but your problems are usually over. Simple as that. As soon as you get a gearbox that's actually made for it and that's brand new with the correct gear ratios and the correct settings and the correct clutch and everything, the correct bell housing, that makes such a huge difference. Also the seat time, obviously. There's a lot of guys that say, no, don't buy an expensive gearbox. Seat time. Yeah, but for seat time the car needs to work. So if you put your car in a trailer and you drive 500 miles and the thing breaks the synchro mesh to second gear, or the tail section breaks off, then you're not going to have much seat time. And obviously everybody always says, yeah, but I can take another gearbox. Yeah, but gearbox and differential failures also usually mean that you have more collateral damage, and it always happens at a bad time. One of my friends actually crashed his car for something as simple as a failing handbrake. So if your gearbox would fail or lock up, or your differential would explode on the wrong moment, it could mean that you're also crashing your car. So that's also something to consider when you run those cheap boxes. So to make a small summary, like, I love the Bolton cars. That's a little bit more expensive to start with. It has a lot less wow factor because it looks like a normal car. And obviously it's super exotic if you see a nice engine swapped into a car, like, oh my God, they put a JZ in some small Datsun or whatever. That's obviously fantastic. I enjoy that as well. But especially if you're not made of money, it may be a better idea to keep saving for a little bit better base car. Like a Z is a pretty good standard car. They're also not that old. The performance E46s, maybe not an M3 but a 330. If we go to the second category, the in-between car, that's, like I said, that's the danger zone, because there are some errors in that. There's conceptual errors. Obviously people will fit an engine into a car which still has a standard frame, which still has a standard headlights and stuff, because they need to drive it on the road, and then they can't fit a correct radiator, or they don't have they have the money to get the right engine, but they can't get the right drivetrain parts, they can't get the right gearbox, because then it spirals out of control. So they start shortcutting all kinds of solutions, which result in a lot of failures. And also there's obviously the problem with the fueling, so it can be a little bit more expensive, a little bit more difficult to get complete standard fuel system the way it exists in a car to work with the performance motor. And also the electrics and the electronics, it's actually very time consuming to integrate an engine into an existing wiring loom in a car. And also you need to understand that there's a lot of provisions in these original cars, in these original wiring looms, that prevent a lot of problems. So there may be some soft starts for certain components, which make sure that it all survives. So it's not that easy. If you build a pro car, which is the third category, a fully built pro car, then you're obviously going to build everything from scratch. So you're going to get a good harness, you're going to get a good engine, nice newly built engine, and you get a good gearbox. Obviously that's the most expensive thing to do with the startup cost. But and I can't say that they hold value very well. Obviously you depreciate a lot when you sell it, but usually they're also easy to sell, so you may not get your money back, but you can get them sold very quickly. You need to make the choice to put it on the trailer and not road drive it anymore. I was super happy that it didn't ship any of my pro cars to America, because it would be so bad to drive either of those for 6,500 miles. So that's what I'm saying. My choices are either a standard car with bolt-ons or a full pro built car. I know that it's super tempting to do an in-between car, because you can keep driving it when you are building it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. You can always comment if you disagree or if you agree, and give me suggestions about the next podcast. Obviously I don't want to insult anyone. I know that the biggest group of drifters exist in the in-between phase, and I totally understand the complete thought process behind that. Like I said, it's also fantastic to find things out on your own. I think that's very, very important in life. You can watch the best podcasts and read the best books, but if you actually have something happen to yourself, then you learn so much more from it. Also, what I'm saying doesn't always have to happen, of course. There's also guys that have a very perfectly well integrated alien engine into a road car chassis that works perfectly well. There was a couple guys on Drift Week that showed that. Like Brian had a Z3 in which he swapped an engine, but that's an engine that sort of belongs in that chassis. So that's obviously a lot easier, much more logical swap. So see you guys soon, be safe, and let me know what you think, and like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and apologize for the shades, but there's a lot of snow over here, so I'm getting so much glare. I don't want to look extra cool or something, but that's just safety. All right guys, be safe.